Here we are now, Gareth, and we haven't got a manager. 12 months later, after Arne Slot coming in season 1 and winning the Premier League, was it the right decision to part with Arne Slot?
I think ultimately yes, although, you know, right now it's still pretty raw from when it happened, obviously Saturday afternoon. I've got mixed feelings about it. You know, I felt when the news come through, I thought, well, why now? Because everything pointed to the fact that he was going to stay. There was talk of a new assistant manager coming in. He'd said himself in multiple press conferences, I'm involved in summer recruitment, I expect to be here next year. And so, you know, I was kind of looking forward to going on holiday and sort of forgetting about it a little bit, and then bang. And it's taken everyone by surprise. You know, you listen to all the reporters who cover Liverpool week in, week out. It's come from left field that they've decided to suddenly do it. And when they're saying it's based on data and it's based on a review, well, you knew what the data was and you knew what all the problems were, you know, last week. So I didn't really get that. Equally, you know, the other side of me is I'm kind of relieved in a way, because I was worried that there was a bit of a Brendan Rodgers type feel about it, where next season could be derailed quite quickly. You know, lose a couple of games, it goes toxic early, and then what are you doing? And who are you recruiting? And what manager are you going to get at that point? And, you know, you've missed the transfer window and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a part of me that thinks if you're going to do it, well, at least it's done. They're talking about a new manager being in place before the World Cup even starts. So that then you think means there's time to have a good run at by the 5 or 6 players we probably need.
Yeah, I'm a bit like you. I could live with whatever decision the club made. Really, I'd got my head around him staying, and I could almost justify it in my head and go, okay, listen, there was injuries, there was new players come in, the situation with Jota, he is a Premier League winning manager. The Salah situation on the pitch and off the pitch must have been a nightmare to deal with. We don't know what goes on behind the scenes, but you can imagine the feeling around. You think, okay, he's moved on. I got my head around it a little bit. Now, I was a little bit that I would change the manager, but for a certain manager, I wouldn't just change him for anyone. It wouldn't be a case of Arne Slot goes and then we're looking for a manager. If we could have got like who I think in my head like a top manager, whether it was Luis Enrique, it might, but that was never going to happen. But I'd have changed him for Xabi Alonso. So as soon as Alonso had gone to Chelsea, I was like, no, I think I'd probably keep him. And now it looks like it's going to be Iraola, who is, I think we'd all say, fantastic, what he's done at Bournemouth. But if you'd have said to me a few weeks ago, would you sack Arne Slot and bring in Iraola, I'd be a little bit like, oh, I'm not sure. I don't know. Because, and I say this for all the clubs, especially the big 6, or the clubs we associate with winning the title, when they make an appointment, I look at it and think, can I see that fellow winning the league? Or winning their club the league? And the thing I always go back to with Slot is we had a manager who won the league, and I know the performances this season was so poor, and the results were so poor, but it was the performances more than anything. So I can get it and go, and I get it. But I just think a manager from Bournemouth who's never had much European experience, managing the Champions League, or certainly done that in England, 3 games a week, I do think it's a risk. I do.
It is a risk, but, you know, I think...
Well, anybody's a risk.
Anyone's a risk, yeah. Any move is a gamble. I think there's maybe a little bit of a dearth of available top-class managers as well. I mean, you know, you look at Mourinho's ended up going back to Madrid and things like that. So, you know, Enrique is the one I think we would have all loved, and we would have walked to the end of the earth to get that man, but, you know, he's lifted another Champions League, he's going nowhere, so that's that done. And then who else is there? With Iraola, I think, like everyone, I like his style of football, and it feels more Liverpool, I've got to be honest. I think one of the problems is last season was such a tough watch. You know, we were going to Anfield and we were just like, you know, the thing you were looking forward to was having a pint with your mates, not the footy. And you know, you had Watkins, you know, basically saying, I know Liverpool are terrible at the back, and I know I'm going to find space and I'm going to exploit it. And you know, that was sort of quite telling as well. There was all the problems with set pieces, there was the start to the games as well, which really did my head in. I mean, if we're playing Man United at Anfield, I expect whoever's wearing the red shirt to go and get stuck in, go and win the first, second balls and all that kind of stuff. We didn't do it. And then it was a repeat of that at Old Trafford.
So my worry with that, Gareth, is when we're talking about Iraola, we're going to go back to that style. Of course, a manager plays his style. But they recruited for an Arne Slot style, which was not quite Jurgen Klopp, it was a bit more control. Now, when we're saying the football wasn't great, you're right, it wasn't. It was slow, laborious, but it wasn't a case of the manager being defensive. He had a lot of attacking players on the pitch. My thing is now, Isak, Wirtz, Ekitike, I'm not sure they are those type of players.
Oh, yeah.
That's my worry. So when we said the football was slow, the pressing wasn't there, it was because we had Wirtz, McAllister in there. Isak doesn't press, he doesn't play too much. Ekitike doesn't really press. So you almost brought these talented players in, and they couldn't play this style that we associated with Klopp. We saw bits of in his first season, and Liverpool went the other way. The reason I said about Alonso is because in the back of my mind I was thinking, this is the guy who's got the best out of Florian Wirtz in terms of Bayer Leverkusen. So we know your most expensive player.
And he's won.
And he's won with them. He's got the connection with the supporters. So that's the one that I'm a little bit like, if you were going to change him, why would it not be Xabi Alonso?
I think that's where the questions start to go upstairs, isn't it? You know, if you're doing a review of the season, why doesn't the review of the season include Richard Hughes, who's the director of football, and Michael Edwards, who's the CEO of football? Because they're the people who are responsible for the recruitment and for buying those players of that profile. And, you know, it felt like all season, you know, I have sympathy there for Slot in that, you know, he's going to a gunfight with a knife almost every week because he hasn't got the squad. Yeah, I think there's an extent to which any manager would have struggled with that squad. I think perhaps they could have got more out of them. Perhaps there could have been more fight. The tactics might have been different. Maybe the set pieces would have been different, whatever. But equally, you know, it wasn't right. It wasn't done properly. And yet them fellas are apparently keeping their jobs. And they've only got 1 year each left on their contract. So there's that uncertainty there as well. And so far, nothing's been said about their roles. And in fact, it seems that Richard Hughes has now been allowed to go and recruit another manager in Iraola, who he's worked with before. So I find all that strange. And one of the explanations really as to why they haven't gone for Alonso has been people saying, well, he's too big of a figure and he could have been too close to the fans. And the nerds, if you like, don't like that. They don't like a manager having that power.
Well, I tell you what, listen, this idea, and I've said this for you, and this goes back to Chelsea as well, I'm sick of these directors of football. Listen, and by the way, I've got great respect for what they did in terms of being there with Klopp, but the longer Klopp's not there, because the people at the top at Liverpool, Michael Edwards especially, he was there under Brendan Rodgers and it wasn't great. Klopp comes in, and Michael Edwards and his team obviously are past that and do a great job. But the most high-profile recruitment team I've ever heard about in my life, everybody talks about them like the fans have got them as these gods. Yeah. As soon as Jurgen Klopp goes, it seems to drop off again. So is Jurgen Klopp the star? I mean, that's what it looks like. Yeah. Great managers make good players even better. That's what the great managers do. That's what they've always done. And that's what I'm looking at a bit. So this idea that like you can just get anybody in as the coach, and this is what Chelsea think as well, just get anyone as the head coach. We do the recruitments. Manager doesn't matter, we just flip them. It matters at Liverpool. Yeah. And that's my little thing about Alonso or Iraola. Iraola's done a brilliant job, but it's a big jump from Bournemouth to Liverpool if he is the guy. With Alonso, you've got the playing career, the CV, the managers he's been managed by, what he did at Leverkusen, playing in getting to a European final, as well as winning the league. Obviously, but he's managed Real Madrid. I know it didn't go well, but he's managed at that level, that sort of scrutiny, that pressure. And that's, if they chose Iraola above Alonso because of that, well, I think that's very worrying for Liverpool going forward. If they've chose somebody else because Alonso wants to play a back three, or it's his style of football, maybe it's a little bit too much like Slot, okay, fair enough, they want to go to the high-pressing game again. But as I said before, I'm not sure Liverpool have got the squad right now for that. But
I was going to say, it's worrying that you mentioned they were bringing an assistant manager in from Holland, whatever that was in the pipeline. Alonso's just gone to Chelsea a few weeks back, so it looks like there was at no stage they spoke to Alonso and Slot was the man for next season. So is it the last 3 or 4 games that they've really gone, this is not good enough? Or you think at that level or that size of football club, you know, the well-run, the best-run football clubs would have a plan in place, and the plan was for Slot to be there next year. So my question is, what actually happened in the last week or 10 days to sort of throw it all out the window and go, we don't want him anymore?
Do you think that, Gareth, something happened I'm not talking about like a couple of days ago. I mean, I spoke to someone around the club and they said that the last 4 or 5 games of the season actually made a big difference, how poor Liverpool were and how they sort of limped across the line to get Champions League football. They made a big play out of that that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah, it would make sense, that, wouldn't it? Because I think, you know, Liverpool have been incredibly fortunate to be in the Champions League next season, and they almost fell over the line. It was almost down to other clubs underperforming and not grasping, you know, the chance to go and get in it themselves, because you know, there was an opportunity there where at one point where we were looking at Man United and saying we can catch them there, and then it just tailed off. And you know, even the very last game of the season, we could have lost that in the last couple of seconds of that game. So you know, there was no control. You know, Chelsea was terrible. I was speaking to, I know he's not here today, but I was speaking to Rory last night, and he was saying he couldn't believe that the state they're in, they were able to come to Anfield, go 1-0 down, and then start dictating the game. And Liverpool are just passive and weak and meek and just letting them have it and letting them come at them. And I think that was worrying. That was obviously the game where quite a few, you know, fans decided to start booing. There's stuff being in the papers since that apparently Slot went absolutely off his head with the players after that game as well. So if they've had a reassessment, then I can sort of understand it, because back to what I said earlier, you start to worry about how's next season going to be then, and how quickly can it go wrong. And they've gone to great pains from the briefings, it seems, to say this is definitely not down to we asked the players and the players didn't want them. But I kind of think, well, they're bound to say that. And there is an element of it. I do wonder how many of them actually wanted to play for them next season, because I found strange in that last game against Brentford, I don't know why Curtis Jones, as a Scouser, scored in front of the cop and then didn't celebrate and in fact looked angry. And I thought, what's going on there? What's in his head? How don't you celebrate that moment? And then even Virgil, you know, after the game's ended, he's on the pitch just staring up at the stands. And again, I thought, well, where's his head at? Why? What's going on there? What's going on inside his mind? Konate's obviously gone as well. Bizarrely, only 6 weeks ago, he was basically, you know, after the derby, wasn't it? He was saying, you know, speak to me soon, you'll see I'm still here, I'm going to take more control, I'm going to be a bigger figure at the club. Now he's gone. What's gone on there? You know, there's loads of little bits where you're wondering what the hell's going on, and maybe we never find out until autobiographies get written in a few years' time or whatever, but it seems like a lot of mad stuff's gone on behind the scenes.
But you know what? I'm a little bit with you. And aren't I slow? When you look how bad last season was, you can't complain too much about the change. And as I said, I could have gone either way. But what I would say is a big thank you to Arne Slot.
Yeah, he won us
a Premier League title. And if someone had said the day Jurgen Klopp announced he was leaving, in the next 2 years we'll win the league and we'll get Champions League football the season after, we'd have all bit your hand off for that.
100%.
So,
best day of my life, because, you know, children being born aside and things like that, because we didn't get to celebrate that other title properly. And you know, all I ever wanted, I've said it on here before, was the lads I've always gone the footy with, we always said, can you imagine that pint when we won the league? And, you know, and we never got to have that pint when we won the league, when it was the COVID season. So Arne Slot got us that moment that we dreamed of for all of our adult lives, to have that pint after we won the title. So for that, Arne Slot,
on the Slot
you.
one then, when he was announced Liverpool manager, were you happy, excited about that? Or were you going like, because you mentioned Iraola there before, and he says, well, I'm not sure, he's coming from Bournemouth, can he do the job?
Oh, no.
Was your mindset when Slot got the job, oh, I'm happy with this guy?
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit like people weren't quite sure who he was or know too much about it, but you had that, okay, winning the league with Feyenoord, he's obviously played European football. Listen, we watch Iraola every week. No one can say you don't love watching Bournemouth play. If Bournemouth are on the TV, you're watching them, aren't you? You think, oh, we're going to watch a good game. So you get that. The point being is how he plays. And I said this at the end of last season. We were talking about the Chelsea manager. It was on Monday Night Football. And we were looking at Chelsea's options. And Iraola was there. And I actually made the point, so I can't go back on it. I said, I think Iraola's making a mistake leaving Bournemouth, because I think the next thing he needs to prove is brilliant manager, great football, high intensity. He needs to prove he can manage a European season with the way what he asks of his players physically, and when you have a Europe, you've got to rotate and you've got to move. So all these things come into it. And I thought that'd be the next step for him, just to prove he could, still produce the goods in a European season, and then he'd get his move to his next club. It almost feels like it's a year. Not too early. Listen, Jurgen Klopp was probably manager of Mainz, and that's the one prove that at Borussia Dortmund with that style of football.
Do you worry that Iraola's will run them into the ground too early? And
that's the feeling. So, do they get injuries? If you look at most of his seasons, I think the second half of the season they drop off. I think last season was the first time. I think they've had a great second half of the season. Normally, they're up there at the start of the season. So these are the things you have to take into account. And then does the intensity actually have to drop off? A little bit, so you're not actually getting the full Iraola because you're getting too many injuries, you've got too many games, and then he's actually going to be more of a footballer manager. You're on the ball more at Liverpool than you are at Bournemouth.